I understand why there might be a sense that somehow being neutral makes Ireland a better peacekeeper, but the reality is that isn't the case. I mean, there might be very specific instances that you could come up with, but I couldn't see any in particular that would make Ireland more successful in the peacekeeping mission than, for example, Norway or Canada or many of the other smaller NATO EU members, Slovenia, for example.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 159 for the 22nd of June 2023. The Financial Times recently made a change to their style guide. The style guide of a newspaper is a list of rules about how articles should be written. All big newspapers have them. It's to keep the language and spelling and so on consistent across the whole publication. So most style guides specify, for example, that numbers up to 10 should be spelled out and numbers from 11 onwards are written as digits, that sort of thing. They also say what spelling and grammar should be used if more than one version is considered correct. The change that the Financial Times made was to treat the word data as singular rather than as a plural. This means instead of writing the data are showing something, they will use English the way most of us do and write the data is showing whatever. There's a concept in linguistics. Yes, I did study it in case you hadn't noticed that before. There is a concept in sociolinguistics, which is about the interaction between language and society, called hypercorrect. Correct language is pretty easy to understand for the most part. If I say, the dog are barking, that's easy to spot as being incorrect grammar. If I say the dog is barking, you all know that's correct. But it's important to understand that those rules aren't made up by some professor in an academy somewhere. The correct use of a language is the way it is spoken by its speakers. Dictionaries and grammar books describe the language. They don't proscribe it. So the dog are barking is clearly wrong. But if instead of saying the dog is always barking, if instead of that I say the dog does be barking all the time, that's not incorrect grammar. It's not an error, it's not wrong, it's not nearly incorrect, it's not a mistake at all. The dog does be barking all the time is not standard English, it's a Hiberno-English dialect, but saying the dog does be barking all the time conforms with the rules of that dialect. That's why it is emphatically not wrong and not a mistake. Now, it's true that standard English is sometimes considered to have a higher status than some dialects of Hiberno-English, so you mightn't want to use that in a job interview or if you were reading the news, but that's a different argument. Lots of people speak different languages, and even the people who don't can often speak several different dialects or registers of their own language. And it's very common to signal the type of interaction that you're having with someone by what register you speak to them in. In a lot of European languages, this is formally marked out. There's a distinction between tu and vous in French, du and sie in German. In English, that distinction is not so formalized, but it does exist. You hear it in things like the switch between I haven't got and I don't have. But the thing about the distinction being more subtle in English is that it can get misunderstood, and people can arbitrarily make up rules that miss the point. I'm sure everyone has in their lives that Maud Flanders figure who wags her finger and tells us, don't say who, say whom. But I'm sure that if you ask them why you should say whom instead of who, they wouldn't be able to do much more than mutter that it's just wrong. And the next time you get that finger wagged in your face, you can tell them from me that they're not just wrong, but they're wrong in two separate ways, either of which alone would invalidate what they're saying. The first is that who and whom are different words. They're two different words. They aren't right or wrong versions of the same word. They are the equivalent of he and him. One is used as the subject of a sentence, one is used as the object. So you would say, he gave it to me, but I gave it to him. In English, this only crops up with pronouns. It's invisible if you say, John gave it to me, or I gave it to John. So to switch that into a question, you can say, who did you give it to? Or if you wanted to follow a very particular outdated grammar format, you could say, to whom did you give it? But there's absolutely nothing in historical or modern grammar to say that the first of those is not correct. So Maud is wrong on that level straight off. But even if she was right, she'd still be wrong. Because there is nothing written anywhere that says that just because something in language was correct in the past, it is still correct now. Language just doesn't work that way. Languages change. All languages change unless they're dead, and they change for a load of different reasons, but one of them is necessity, and our language just wouldn't work if we tried to keep it the same as it was hundreds of years ago. But that's got nothing to do with Maud wagging her finger at you and making badly grounded complaints about your grammar. What's going on there is that someone is trying to win a game of social one-upmanship, to show off that they're better educated than you and to put you down in the process. This type of behaviour usually comes from people who are insecure about their own level of education and trying to cover for that by displaying superiority. And that insecurity is probably why so many people doing that are actually making silly grammar mistakes themselves. Probably the richest vein of excuses for finger wagging comes from Latin. There was a collective gasp of horror when newer versions of Star Trek changed their introductory line from "to boldly go where no man has gone before." They changed it to boldly go where no one has gone before. So they fixed the potentially sexist bit, but they didn't fix the supposedly bad grammar of a split infinitive, to boldly go. In case you didn't get that chiding, someone somewhere decided that since Latin infinitives are one single word, they can't be split. The infinitive is the base form of a verb before it's changed for a tense or for who it relates to. And since that one word Latin infinitive can't be split, then English two-word infinitives, to go, also should not be split. You shouldn't put the word boldly in between them to make to boldly go. What they didn't explain was why. The only justification was because that's the way it's done in Latin, rather missing the point that we're not speaking Latin. The Romans did a whole load of things that we don't do, like crucify people, but that alone isn't a good reason for us to do the same. As I said, languages change over time. They usually tend towards simplification and regularity, but that isn't always the case. English has many regular verbs. You add "ed" to make the past tense. Look, looked, walk, walked. But English still has a lot of what are called strong verbs, mostly inherited from German, where a vowel change makes the past tense, like bleed, bled, forget, forgot, begin, began. Languages tend towards regularity, but not always. One exception in English is hang. The original past tense was regular, hanged. But the word was very close to some strong verbs like sing, sink, ring, which go sang, sank, rang. And over time, what was originally a mistake, the word hung, became accepted. But there was a catch. In the past, when handing down a death sentence, judges had a prepared text to read, which included saying, "You will be hanged by the neck until dead." And this didn't change because it was part of an accepted legal formula. So by staying the same, judges found themselves out of step with modern usage, which had shifted. Now, the finger waggers couldn't say that someone as important and educated as a judge got their grammar wrong, but did that stop them? Not at all. Out of nowhere, They just invented a new rule saying pictures are hung, people are hanged. This has absolutely no basis in anything other than a desire to tell people off without risking offending someone in authority. And that brings me back to the data are. The justification for this, like the imaginary rule against split infinitives, is Latin. Data, we are scolded, is a Latin plural and therefore should have a plural verb, are, not is. It's true, in Latin, the word data is the plural of datum, but this is still wrong on so many levels. The first, and to me the most important, is that it sounds terrible. To me that's enough. If it sounds bad, ditch it. You might think that's subjective, but it's actually not. I'll explain in a minute. Another reason it's wrong is that we aren't speaking Latin, so there's no reason to follow Latin grammar rules. And in particular, when words transfer from one language to another, it's common for their grammatical properties to change. There is a direct analogy from a language very closely related to Latin. Spaghetti is a plural. It's the plural of spaghetto. But nobody ever says the spaghetti are hot. That's because in English, spaghetti is a singular. It's uncountable, like water or air. The difference is that spaghetti is an everyday word. The word data is one that's strongly associated with research and universities, where I think you might get an oversupply of people who are anxious to show off how educated they are and how well they fit into their chosen academic clique. And they do this by using this awkward phrasing that distinguishes them from the great unwashed. It sounds odd, it catches in the ear, and that's exactly what it's meant to do. It's intended to make you pay attention to how clever the speaker is. I said that it sounds terrible and that that's not a subjective judgment, and I said I'd say why. I mentioned uncountable nouns, things like liquids or powders, that they're treated as singular in every language that I know of. The water is cold, the flour is in the cake. But English also treats very small things that are difficult to count as singular, like rice, sand, and even spaghetti. These are treated as plurals in other languages, notably Romance languages descended from Latin. Data, particularly in the context that researchers refer to it, is typically a large number of individual points of information. It fits very well into the conceptual frame that applies to rice and sand, that even if the individual components could be counted, they're not considered separately and they're too small to practically be counted out individually. Objectively speaking, the word data in English fits very well into that category, and aside from the snobbery and finger wagging, that's why it sounds bad to say the data are. So I'm glad that the Financial Times are making that change. And I may have to tag Dan McClellan, a guest we had on the podcast a while back, on this.
There are no data that suggests there's anything. It's a misrepresentation of those data, and so there are absolutely no data that connect. There are no data that support this. There are no other data that point to any kind of.
And there are no data that pre-exist this manuscript.
There are no data that support this claim.
There are no data that support a global flood. There are no data that indicate this.
In a moment we'll have the interview, but first I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. We really appreciate everyone who donates. We don't get a huge amount of money. We're not in the same league as some major podcasters, but we really appreciate it. It pays for things like web hosting. Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. And a new patron on Patreon is also a great morale booster. It lets us know that there's people out there listening and appreciating the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in the Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think that you could do the same as those patrons and throw in a couple of euro once or twice a month, there's details of how to do that on the website and at the end of the show. In the week that we are publishing this podcast, the government's Consultative Forum on International Security Policy is beginning its work. We're not getting a citizens' assembly on this. That's its own story. But I think that Ireland can be very insular on this particular debate. So to balance this out, on the line, I'm talking to Professor James Kerr-Lindsay, who is a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. James, your profile says that your research focuses on conflict, peace and security in southeastern Europe and on the European Union and its enlargement and on secession and recognition in international politics. But you published a video on Irish neutrality, which is at the other end of Europe. Despite that, I think you had a very interesting perspective. And my first question for you was going to be, how is Irish neutrality perceived by the international community? But I think that question has one word too many in it. So what I want to really find out is Irish neutrality perceived by the international community? Does anyone notice?
Look, great question. And I think what I'll do is I'll start by sort of addressing that strange point, as you said, that I seem to focus on Southeast Europe, but here I am talking about Irish neutrality in
Northwest,
one of my videos.
The exact opposite.
Exactly. No, look, I think in fact, so I work on international security issues, and so much of what we see in Southeast Europe informs wider debates. I mean, it really does sort of pull together a lot of these. And a country that I've spent a lot of time working on, a country where I've lived in the past, is Cyprus, which of course is also one of the other European countries which is neutral. And so I started taking a real interest in Cypriot foreign policy. In fact, officially it was non-aligned during the Cold War. And what we saw is that it had to give that up when it joined the European Union, but it's not a member of NATO either. And in looking at all these issues to do with international relations on the channel, I started looking, for example, at the decision by Finland and Sweden to join NATO. And I then started thinking, well, it'd be really interesting to look at other countries that are neutral as well. What is the background to it? What are the internal debates about it? So I looked at Switzerland, which in many ways we think of as the archetypical neutral state, Austria as well, which is a fascinating story. And Ireland seemed to be a very obvious candidate in that list of countries that I was going through. So I made this video, and I have to say it's had a phenomenally interesting reaction. Second most watch video I've ever produced. So this is a long preamble to sort of explain a little bit about, tackling that point that you raised at the start of, here I am, why as someone who specializes on Southeast Europe am I talking about Irish neutrality in Northwest Europe? But I think to turn to the main point is that I think in many ways you're right. If you were to ask people, which countries in the world are neutral, I mean, I'd say 9 times out of 10, somebody would say Switzerland. People might be aware that Austria is neutral, although, again, the response I had on that video showed that actually there were a surprising number of people who weren't aware that it was neutral. Sweden, obviously, is a country that comes up, although obviously it's made its decision to relinquish that neutrality. But you're right, very few people would immediately think of Ireland. I think that the natural reaction would be that, well, I always thought it was a member of NATO. And I think that would probably be a fairly, fair reaction for people to have. I mean, it's not something, as you can imagine, that most people are particularly aware of. There isn't much of a debate about Irish foreign policy in general in international circles, and that's no criticism of Ireland. I mean, it's the case for a lot of countries in the European Union that they don't really come onto the radar until something major happens that puts them on the radar. And so I think you're right. I think most people probably wouldn't know a lot about Irish foreign policy and about Ireland's sort of position on neutrality and why it got there and why it's now open for debate.
And does that have an impact on policy? I can imagine perhaps it might get us some ill feeling in American military circles. Is that balanced by some consideration on what used to be the Soviet bloc side, which is now turning back, I think, very quickly into the Cold War, perhaps not even cold. But do you get any sense that anti-NATO forces around the world cut Ireland any more slack than they might otherwise?
I mean, this touches on so much of what I.
Oh, give me a yes or no.
If you're going to push me on this, no, I don't think it really comes into it. I know a lot of people would like to think that it does, but it doesn't. And I give two very good answers that, or two answers that I think are good answers to this. So you will often hear people in Ireland say that Ireland's position on neutrality allows it to act as a mediator. In actual fact, if you were to ask me which country would I hold up as the most successful mediator in international relations, the one which has a phenomenally good track record, which actually puts the mediation of international conflict front and center of its foreign policy, I would say Norway. Mm-hmm. And Norway,
which is a member of NATO.
Absolutely. Norway is a NATO member and a long-standing, very, very important NATO member. Remembering that, prior to Finland's membership and throughout the entire Cold War, Norway was one of only two direct routes into the Soviet Union for NATO. The other one being Turkey, which was actually a far more hospitable route, if you like. Going through Norway was obviously an Arctic route into the Soviet Union. But Norway was a key member, and yet it also has played a really, really important role in international peacemaking. It's very highly respected around the world. I mean, if we think of one of the most successful, or at the time it seems successful, peace processes, was, of course, the Oslo Accord, which, allowed for Israel and Palestine to engage with one another and form the basis for a Middle East peace process that sadly hasn't gone nearly as far as many of us would have liked to have seen. So I think that's incredibly important to emphasize. The other point that comes into this, of course, is Irish peacekeeping. And, this is something that I've been very interested in for a very long time. I lived in Cyprus, and when I first lived in Cyprus, it was a time when Ireland was still participating in UNFICYP.
Mm-hmm. And this is the force, I should just say for people who are not familiar, this is the force that essentially separates or is peacekeeping between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, or just Turkey, which invaded the north of Cyprus and took over essentially half of the island, and there is a frozen conflict there.
Exactly. So you have UNFICYP, which was set up in 1964, and Ireland, came in and was a major player in that and performed very well. But also, I can still remember that Ireland, of course, has a major role in UNIFIL, which is the force in neighbouring Lebanon, just across the water from Cyprus. And so Ireland obviously has a tremendously rich history in terms of UN peacekeeping. But of course, this also isn't precluded by NATO membership. So, I found yesterday one of the comments I got on the video was saying to me, but, this would, count Ireland out of peacekeeping, and it wouldn't. In fact, if you
are there examples of NATO members in taking part in this?
Well, I mean, I looked through the figures, and Italy, Spain, France, and Germany all contribute more troops to UN peacekeeping operations at the moment than Ireland.
All of whom are members of NATO.
Yeah, exactly. And now, of course, you could make the argument that on a per capita basis, Ireland is probably the biggest contributor in the European Union. And if it were to join NATO, would be indeed. But the main point is the suggestion that somehow being a NATO member would keep Ireland from performing that incredibly valuable role as a UN peacekeeper is not founded in the actual reality of how peacekeeping operations are handled. So it wouldn't preclude Ireland from performing either of those two key roles, either as a peacekeeper or as a peacemaker.
And is that just entirely a fallacy, or is there any distinction at all in terms of supplying peacekeeping troops? Is there any distinction between NATO countries, non-NATO countries, neutral countries, or is that just entirely false?
It hasn't really played a part since the end of the Cold War.
Okay.
So when peacekeeping was originally envisaged, I mean, essentially UN peacekeeping, it's not mentioned in the UN Charter. It was something that was a product of circumstances, and it essentially emerged during the Cold War in those cases where neither the Soviet Union or the United States had direct influence over a particular country, but equally they didn't want the other side to have influence. So in effect,
so is it? Could I ask James then? Is it possible that there's no written rule against it, but just the unwritten individual circumstances of each case made it easier in some cases for neutral Ireland and Nepal and a few other countries to supply troops that was more acceptable than NATO members, perhaps? But it's not. There's no hard and fast rule.
No. One of the countries, the NATO countries, that really stands out for having an incredibly strong history of peacekeeping is Canada.
Mm-hmm.
It's
also a NATO member.
Also a NATO member, right from the first days of peacekeeping. It really is. And in fact, actually, considered to be the father of peacekeeping is somebody called Lester Pearson, a Canadian. So, and Canada was a NATO member. So again, I mean, I understand why there might be a sense that somehow being neutral makes Ireland a better peacekeeper, but the reality is that isn't the case. I mean, there might be very specific instances that you could come up with, but I couldn't see any in particular that would make Ireland more successful in the peacekeeping mission than, for example, Norway or Canada or many of the other smaller NATO EU members, Slovenia, for example, than Ireland. So I don't think NATO plays as much a role as people might think it does in precluding or including Ireland in peacekeeping operations.
Okay, those are perhaps external justifications for neutrality, and it's probably worth noting that there's been opinion polling on this recently in that 61% of people, according to an Irish Times Ipsos poll, want to retain the current model and want to keep Ireland neutral and not a member of NATO. The Irish Times actually, at least on social media, falsely reported this, saying that 56% of people wanted to join NATO. That's incorrect. 56% of 26% who favoured a change wanted Ireland to join NATO. So that's a very, very weak, that's, 14, 15% of people versus 61% saying not change. So that's a very weak support indeed for NATO. But I'm wondering, would you agree, and do you think it is perceived internationally that NATO membership might be a proxy debate amongst the political class in Ireland for a whole range of things, some of them perhaps nothing to do with NATO and international politics, and that this is a badge to be worn by particular politicians, and it proves their credentials for entirely separate issues, and that whole thing of NATO membership is, much more tied up with a perhaps more left-wing and more nationalist theme in politics. A, to the extent that you know about that, do you agree? And B, do you think that's appreciated internationally?
So, I'm not going to pretend that, I'm an expert on Irish politics to be able to sort of go into the precise details about the internal debates on this. I mean, of course, I'm very interested in it, and, I'm certainly following the debates as we're seeing at the moment. And
okay, well,
right.
give us the external view then. Does the general public and the security officials who matter, do either of those two populations on any side in any country in the world that matters have any appreciation of that and perhaps discount Ireland's position on that basis?
No, I think, I think every country is aware that there are very, very strong domestic factors that shape foreign policy. I mean, it's perfectly natural. I think, if I were to say what seems to be the issue here is that neutrality has become, for many people, a part of the Irish identity. And this is not something that is limited to Ireland. As I say, having looked at the neutrality debates in other countries, one can see very much the same sort of trend.
Oh, tell me, I'm very interested in this. Where are there parallels?
Well, take your pick, frankly. Switzerland, Austria. It was very much a sense that neutrality had become a part of the identity, to the point that people forgot the origins of that neutrality. They just sort of said, we are neutral. This is who we are. We mustn't give it up under any circumstances. But they'd sort of forgotten why the country became neutral. And if you look at it, every country has very, very different reasons for their neutrality. That there isn't a single strand. If you look at Sweden, if you look at Finland, if you look at Switzerland, if you look at Austria, if you look at Cyprus, if you look at Ireland, every single one of those cases is completely different from each other, but all of them are tied together by the fact that for a very long time, the population said, we're neutral. It's who we are. We don't question it.
Well,
and I'm
intrigued by that.
Questions opened up.
I'm intrigued by that because you may or may not know there is a famous photograph now more than 100 years old outside what was then Liberty Hall shortly before World War I, and the banner was, "We serve neither king nor Kaiser but Ireland," and that very, very closely tied together Irish nationalism with neutrality. And I'm not entirely sure that there has been a practical debate. There's been a principal debate on it since then, but I don't think there's been a practical debate on it since then. But without going into it, because I don't think we can go into the minutiae of Swiss or Finnish politics, but as you understand it, is there similar emotional and just established reasons for neutrality in all of those countries?
Well, look, I won't go into the details, but maybe listeners would be interested to know what they are. So we think of Switzerland as the archetypical neutral country, that this is something so embedded in Swiss identity. Why was Switzerland neutral? It was neutral simply because it was a way of stopping France and Austria-Hungary or the Austrian Empire from going to war. Mm-hmm. It was imposed
was that externally
that was 200
imposed?
years ago, externally imposed 200 years ago. They said, right, okay, we're going to put Switzerland off the geopolitical map between these two European empires. 200 years later, here we are. Switzerland is still neutral. Everyone's forgotten. No one's alive from when that decision was taken, but it's there. Austria, it was imposed after the Second World War. It was the way that Stalin said, right, okay, if you don't want Austria to be divided in the way that Germany was, because in fact Austria did. It had zones of occupation like Germany did. The agreement was if it wasn't going to be partitioned in the way that Germany was, then it would become neutral. Sweden, why did Sweden become neutral? It became neutral because it took an absolute hammering during the Napoleonic Wars and lost a whole swathe of territory and said, you know what, we're not going to make that mistake again. Far better, we're just not going to go to war with anyone. And that, Finland, again, imposed during the Cold War. It was
with Finland, it was very much externally imposed, wasn't it?
Exactly. And so for the Finns, it was always a sense that this wasn't a choice that they had made for themselves. And so in many ways, it's probably Finland has been the country where the debate has been strongest in favour of joining NATO. They have a border with Russia. They feel the nervousness there. They have a bit of history, as you know, with Russia over the centuries. So it was very much a sense that Finland was the country that was most willing to ditch that long-standing neutrality. But I think it's important to look at the background to each of these countries and realise, how very different they are. And in the case of Ireland, one can understand the roots of neutrality. It's absolutely, and here I am, you're picking up from my accent where I'm from, and I'm more than aware.
You'll have to specify.
I by the way, for anyone who sort of like would be, listen to the Englishman speak, I get very upset when anyone ever calls me English. I'm not English. I'm only partly. I have a very, very Scottish surname. I'm quarter Welsh. And like so many others in this country, I have Irish ancestry and a DNA proof to show it as well. Sadly, not enough to get me an Irish passport like so many of my compatriots, and I have looked into it. But the reality is that, I am very, very aware of the very difficult and dark history that exists between Britain and Ireland, and I understand why the debate in Ireland was focused originally on saying, listen, we have been under British colonialism. We're not going to get dragged into British wars. As our own independent state, we're not going to. We're in a very privileged position at the end of Europe. We don't need to be dragged into these wars. And I fully understand and appreciate that argument and the historical context behind that argument. But I think, like a lot of other people, my view would be, but we now live in a very different era.
Pause on that for a second, James, because I want to come back to that idea of Ireland being in a privileged position. But just very briefly, because on Finland, I want to just clarify one question, and I can see that Kevin is mentioning to me here how was neutrality imposed on Finland. As I understand it, essentially the Soviets after World War II said, if you don't want to be a Soviet satellite state like Poland, that's okay. You can be capitalist more or less and a democracy, even though you're on the borders of the Soviet Union, but it would be unacceptable to have a NATO member within a few dozen kilometers of, as it was, Leningrad. And that was basically a deal in the way that, if not written down, but at least a deal made between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union in the aftermath of World War II. So, Finland may not have had an equally emotional attachment to neutrality as Ireland. And carrying on from that, it is now the weakness of Russia that allows Finland to join. Is that a correct perception on that?
Yes, very, very beautifully put. Exactly. In a nutshell, that's exactly what happened. Finland found itself a bit like Austria, but of course Austria was occupied because it had, it had been one of the protagonists during the Second World War. Finland, it was very different. I mean, Finland actually had a war, of course, with Russia.
Soviet Union
and
prior to that, but I don't want to get into that because I want to. You mentioned,
but effectively, yes, exactly, the Soviet Union and that was the price that it had to pay. It had to become neutral.
Okay, so I want to then, because you said Ireland being, as we have noted, on the far northwestern corner of Europe, had the privilege of just basically being out of the way and being able to be neutral and not have those decisions externally imposed. My question then is, in the way that the internet and various communication technologies have dissolved distance for business, is it possible that that privilege, that advantage that Ireland has had up to now is perhaps also being dissolved by new technology, and just plain old distance doesn't cut it anymore, and we may not be able to survive as neutrals for that reason?
Well, I think there are two parts to that question, in effect. I mean, there's I think the very technological discussion, which is the one that's been raised, which is Ireland sits right at the northwest part of Europe. It's far from the front line with Russia, which is considered a main threat. But of course, the international system now it's not just about Russia. There's also a sense of a growing challenge from China. Now, many people, many of your listeners might disagree with that, but that seems to be the perception. But there is also a sense that Ireland plays a very important role in technological linkages in the international system now. The cables that come out of Ireland, those could be, attacked by various countries. And this is critical infrastructure that needs to be protected, and it needs to be protected for the interests of Western countries generally, but also, if Ireland is to continue to play that role, I think there will be a sense, and this is something that's coming into the debate, what is it doing to ensure that those cables are adequately protected? Now, there's two answers to that, and maybe jumping ahead of the gun for the next part of the discussion, which is, do you bolster Irish Defence Forces to be able to take on that role? Or do you say, well, the other alternative is to bring Ireland into NATO? But that's one side of the debate. The other one about distance, I think is a very important one. And that touches on what I would see as more of the moral argument that we have about Irish membership of NATO and abandoning neutrality, which is that Ireland is in a privileged position of being where it is. It doesn't have a border with Russia, but there are many EU members, fellow countries in the European Union that feel very genuinely very worried about the direction that Russia is taking, that see the war in Ukraine as nothing less than an existential war, that if Russia wins this, then it'll be them next. And there's an argument that,
I should pause, James, I should say that if you look at Russian internal media, that's exactly what they're saying. They're explicitly and directly saying that.
Yes, the Baltic republics, for example, the Baltic states, the former Baltic republics of the Soviet Union, that there is a real sense of worry there, that there's a real sense of concern in Poland about this, that you see this, that, and so many would argue that these are fellow EU members of Ireland These are countries that don't have the luxury of sitting at the other end of Europe, that have stood by Ireland on issues. I would, most
not least Brexit.
Prominently Brexit, exactly, and have said, look, we understand Ireland, the special position you find yourself in, the destabilising nature of Brexit, and lined up behind Ireland. Now, people would say, but that's not the same as sending troops to defend these countries. Maybe not, but I think that there is still the argument that would say that, it's about solidarity. It's about European countries recognizing the multitude of threats, challenges that they have, and responding in a way that each one says to the other, we stand behind you. We will help you. This is where you get to a very interesting other debate, which is of course, the difference between political and military neutrality. And Ireland has completely ditched the idea of political neutrality. And in which case,
and what is the difference anyway?
Why is military neutrality then so problematic?
And what is the difference anyway? I'm not even clear on that.
I don't think anyone is, to be honest. How can you say, yep, absolutely, we're not going to sit on the fence. Russia is an aggressor here. We're going to impose sanctions on it. We're going to take a tough stance on it. But somehow, militarily, we must retain our neutrality. We won't back that up. And I think this is what is causing a lot of people, frankly, to scratch their heads about this, that they can't see, if you break it down, why, you're either neutral and you say across the board, we're just not going to take sides. We're just going to, we're going to be a peace broker and we're going to, perform that role. Or you say, you know what, we're all in. We live in a different world and Ireland needs, and hopefully it will never come to it, that Ireland needs to back up its other EU partners, other Western partners, and say, if worst comes to the worst, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, if you're ever invaded, we will do our part. We will do our part to help defend you. And I think that, this, to my mind, is a very powerful argument. And of course, I understand a lot of people in Ireland would say, well, no, we mustn't give up on our neutrality. But I think, as I say, tying it all together, looking at the history of it, looking at where we stand at the moment, looking at the current Irish political policy on the war in Ukraine and its links with European Union as part of the West, it just seems that idea of military neutrality doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of outside observers.
Okay, I want to roll two questions then up together. One of which is, and we noticed just before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there was an incident whereby Russian warships were allegedly carrying out exercises pretty close to the Irish coastline, legally, in the sense that they were not encroaching on Irish territorial waters, but still in the Irish economic zone. That was something most Irish people, I think, were very unhappy with, and Irish fishermen performed an extraordinary role in deterring that. And the second thing that I'm throwing into that is that it seems to me that neutral countries tend to have large and powerful arms industries because they want to be able to supply, their own arms. They're not dependent on allies, which they don't have, to supply their own arms. And that then tends to make them into quite large arms exporters, Sweden and Switzerland being notable on that. And whatever about Ireland having either the capacity or the desire to turn into an arms manufacturer, let alone an arms exporter, is it at all feasible that Ireland could expand its naval and military capacity sufficiently in order to be able to defend even just those very vital data lines under the sea coming into Ireland? Well,
again, this raises up so many interesting points on how we understand sort of NATO as an organization and things. So, there would be a sense, joining NATO is going to require Ireland to make a massive investment in defence, and it's going to have to bolster the number of troops in the defence forces. It's going to have to increase its air force, its navy. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit more fine-grained than that. That yes, Ireland will definitely have to increase its defence spending. Now, as you'll be aware, and I'm sure many listeners will, NATO has an across-the-board countries that are members are meant to be spending 2% of GDP on defence. which would be a very, very significant increase for Ireland. I can't remember how much it is. I think it's 0.3% of GDP at the moment, maybe 0.5. So we're talking anywhere between a 4 to 6-fold increase in defence expenditure. But that doesn't necessarily mean that suddenly you're going to have sort of a mass recruitment for soldiers into the defence forces. It can be spent in different ways. And in actual fact, it's also worth pointing out that there is, in fact, a NATO member that doesn't actually have an armed force at all, which is Iceland.
Uh-huh.
It performs a vital role for NATO as a way of listening surveillance for the North Atlantic.
Yes. Iceland, it is worth saying that Iceland has a population of about 1/3 of 1 million people. So any contribution it would make would be slight, to put it mildly. Ireland, I'm seeing here, spends less than 1/3 of 1% of GDP on defence. So we would need to increase that 6-fold in order to meet that NATO requirement. It is worth saying, though, that up to the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, many other NATO members did not meet that threshold either, although Poland has now increased it, and Poland are cruising towards 4%, which is something like double the requirement. One thing that I kind of just want to understand on that is you are saying, if I understand you correctly, that the cost of NATO membership would be very significant in monetary terms. We don't know what that consideration is feeding into the opinion poll figures very much against joining NATO. But is the current situation feasible? So in other words, is that an avoidable cost? Will Ireland end up having to increase the costs anyway?
Well, It's a difficult question to answer because, there's so many different factors to how this comes in. Look, what we can say for certain is that if Ireland joins NATO, it will require an increase in its defence expenditure. But as you're aware, there is already significant calls for Ireland to do that, regardless of whether it ditches its neutrality or joins NATO. And as you quite rightly pointed out, most other neutral countries have significant defence capabilities in their own right. They spend a lot of money on their defence. The big exception to this is Austria, by the way, which, and that's part of the thing. It's sort of, it doesn't spend enough on its defence. But the Swiss, very well armed, conscription, extensive arms industry. You're right about Finland. You're right about Sweden. Cyprus, for different reasons. It has military conscription and it spends a lot on defence because of the issue with Turkey. So Ireland is a bit of an outlier along with Austria in that, it doesn't spend much on the defence. It doesn't have particularly, significant defence capabilities in its own right, and it hasn't got its own independent defence industries to back up those independent capabilities. So it's in a very, very different position on this. And, so you're hearing a lot of people say, well, if we don't need to spend the money, why divert it from schools? Why divert it from hospitals? Mm-hmm. And it really comes back down to this solidarity argument that, people would say, look, Ireland is far wealthier. I know that the GDP figures are inflated because of tech investments and things.
But nevertheless, Ireland is a wealthy country.
Technically speaking, Ireland is, of course, the richest EU member per capita. Now, as I say, I understand that on the ground, people don't see it that way. It doesn't flow through in quite as straightforward a way as it would look on paper. But nevertheless, the argument is there that why is Poland, why are Latvia, Lithuania in a better economic situation to have to pay for defence simply by virtue of geography than Ireland? They have to. They have no choice but to do this. And so the argument would be that, and if they were to find themselves weakened, if they then were to become, subject to Russian aggression later, and again, I understand that many listeners might say, well, that's just not going to happen. It's overplayed. But the reality is a lot of people never thought that Russia would invade Ukraine. And it's only by virtue that Ukraine had been spending on its defence and that, it had undergone significant upgrades over the past, essentially 8 years since the invasion of Crimea, that it's been able to beat back. And this is the sense these countries have to be doing this, to defend. And the argument is that other countries that stand behind them are going to rely on that ability that, God forbid, if something were to happen, that they need to be able to defend themselves. NATO needs to be able to come in. And frankly, Ireland's entire prosperity will be sunk if those countries go to war. I mean, this will have a huge impact on the European Union generally. So one could argue that, yes, it would be a direct economic increase for Ireland. It would be an expense. But you could also argue that there would be a huge, wider political, diplomatic, economic, social expense if war was to proliferate. So in actual fact, it's part of deterrence. It's paying to defend those countries and make it clear that Ireland is willing to help defend them, which hopefully makes that cost, it won't spiral out by a full-scale war.
Okay. I made an argument on a recent podcast essentially about Finland, that Finland is incredibly well armed, incredibly well trained, and has a very, very high degree of preparedness. If you get at a map and compare Finland and Russia, you might almost laugh at the idea that Finland could defend itself against Russia, but that might not be the exact point. The point of Finland being very well armed and very highly prepared is to deter war. In other words, to put the cost for Russia of any potential invasion of Finland, to make that cost so high that it's not worth attacking them in the first place. And they may remember that a similar thing happened in history at the start of World War II. Russia essentially failed in a war against Finland, who displayed a very strong ability to defend their own territory, although they did lose some territory towards the end of that war. But they, I think that was at least a victory on points for Finland. Ireland, and many of the people in Ireland, and I suspect many of the people who support neutrality in that opinion poll, as reported, I think maybe looking at the wars of the late 20th century, going from like the Vietnam War, wars in Iraq and so forth, and that the way NATO, or at least Britain and the United States, were using their military seemed to Ireland to be absolutely morally indefensible. And throwing our lot in with that is very, that doesn't seem like a moral thing to do. And the idea of solidarity with that is not something that I think either I or anybody else would find very appealing. Now, bookending that, there's no question that most people in Ireland would view the Allies in World War II as having been a very moral war and being fought a very supportable fight against the Nazis. And at the other end now, I think there's enormous, with some very small and odd exceptions, there's enormous support for Ukraine within Ireland in their their battle for survival. Which do you think is more valid there? Which view is more valid? The bookends, the World War II and the Ukraine wars being seen as, being something that Ireland, at least morally could support, or all those other wars in between, which were essentially Cold War proxy wars very often, and it has become a joke down to, Gordon Ramsay saying some dishes so full of oil that the Americans are in danger of invading. That just became a cliche of they were essentially neo-colonialist wars. Is there any guarantee that if we join on the basis of defending Ukraine and possibly also Poland and the Baltic states, that we will not then be in for supporting the next neo-colonial adventure, be it in Bolivia to secure lithium mines or whatever the resources of the 21st century are?
I hear this a lot, and I understand why people think this, but I think I'd say that this loses sight of what NATO really is. It's very easy, you'll hear the argument across the board, NATO is just an American stooge, it's just an American tool. It's not, and it never has been. It doesn't work that way. You cannot persuade what is now 31 countries, very, very different traditions, very different histories, very different international relations, to sign up to wars of aggression. It's as simple as that. Iraq was not a NATO war. Remembering, of course, and it's amazing how much time.
What was the technical status of the
years ago?
Yeah, what about the first Iraq war under George H.W. Bush?
Well, that was UN Security Council mandated. That was do you know what? That was probably one of the clearest cut just wars, if you look at the tradition of just war, that we've seen in modern times. Saddam Hussein invaded a sovereign state. It went before the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council authorized that war, and it was carried out in the name of the United Nations. Mm-hmm. So there's no question at all. I mean, it was a very, very clear example, but it wasn't a NATO war. It was actually one of the few cases where I think we could say that the international community, this was a war of the international community against a clear act of aggression.
Was it that clear? Saddam Hussein was installed by the, let us say, the Anglo-American alliance, as it is perceived in Ireland. There isn't perceived to be a huge difference between A, the UN alliance that attacked in the first Gulf War, B, the essentially just British-American alliance that attacked in the second Iraq war, which people would argue would seem to have been entirely illegal, and all the other military adventures. To turn back to what I started with, in Ireland, people don't see any particular distinction between those, and there might be some kind of technical politicking and further justification, but there isn't, either a moral difference seen between the two or any real political decision-making difference between the two. Both decisions were made somewhere between the White House and the Pentagon, and with the odd consultation with London. Well, but then those who make that view, I think there's a danger of entering into the territory of cakeism. That they would say, we don't want to join NATO because it's going to be a tool of, Anglo-American imperialism, and that isn't the case. NATO just doesn't go to war on a whim. It can only do so by unanimity. Iraq was a case that Britain and America went to war, but the cakeism comes in because you're saying the phrase "having your cake and eat it" applies to this. Having your cake and eat it. So in that case, it's why aren't people in Ireland absolutely condemning the United States across the board and saying this is an evil actor and everything like that? Oh, we can't join NATO because it wages all these wars of aggression. In fact, it isn't. It is essentially a defensive alliance, and it's, I think, part of the problem with this whole debate, and it's not just in Ireland. You see it a lot of the places. To be fair to a lot of people in Ireland who would support NATO, they would condemn the United States across the board militarily, cultural and economic connections notwithstanding. Absolutely, and across NATO, we saw a lot of. Just thinking back, 1 million people took to the streets in Britain to condemn the invasion of Iraq that was considered to be illegal. Across the European Union, across NATO members, France and Germany absolutely said this is illegal. We are not going to be part of any of this. And so I think this is the argument that people will too readily conflate NATO with being a tool of the United States, when in actual fact, it isn't. That's the whole point. It is essentially a defensive alliance. It's just very easy to just roll it all up into a single bundle and just say, this is terrible. This is, Western imperialism writ large in the 21st century. And I disagree. And that's not to say that one can't be critical of what the United States did or Britain did. Absolutely, we can be very critical of it. But I think we need to be careful about then extending it out and saying this is also what NATO does, because that is not Norway. That is not Slovenia. That is not Estonia. That is not Portugal. These are very, very different countries with very different traditions that don't by and large have a record of aggression. So the fact that the United States invaded Iraq can't be read onto NATO because it wasn't a NATO conflict. So I think we need to be really, really very clear in our minds what NATO essentially stands for, and how NATO decision-making works. So you brought up the example of sort of invading a South American country over lithium mines. Good luck getting that passed, because there are members of NATO who are very, very staunch defenders of international law who would just simply say, no, we're not going to do that. That's a war of aggression. That is not what NATO has been set up to do. James Kerr-Lindsay, the visiting professor at the London School of Economics, specialising in Southeastern Europe and also European Union enlargement and secession and recognition in international politics, and quite an expert on Irish neutrality. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you so much for having me on, and found it really, really interesting debate. And I'll be following, the course of the debate in Ireland with a lot of interest.
James, thank you very much.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow James Kerr-Lindsay at James Kerr-Lindsay. And get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. It covers the cost of keeping the podcast going, and if you could throw in the price of a pint, or even the price of a curly whirly once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.